My name is Katie Lamke, and today we're going to be talking about the bumblebee species that you can find in Nebraska. So in the state, we have about 20 different species that are all displayed on the sheet here, which should be in your participant handbook. And you can also find it online at nebraskabumblebeeatlas.org. And it can look a little bit overwhelming if this is your first sort of deep dive into bumblebee identification. But once you start paying attention to the bees, it'll become a little bit easier. And the sheet is actually well organized once you become familiar with it. So when you have a bee in front of you, the first thing that you should do is check to see if it has any red on the body or any white on the body. And if so, then it's pretty likely that the bee that you've collected is in one of these two boxes. If not, then check to see if it has stripes on it or if it has a black tail. And again, if it doesn't match any of those categories, then you're going to look at the cuckoo bumblebees, or if you're sampling near the borders of Nebraska, it's possible that you collected a species that doesn't commonly occur here. So we're going to go through all of these species and highlight some of the key characteristics of how to identify them, look at their range throughout the United States, as well as where they've been collected in Nebraska. And hopefully that'll give you a better idea of some of the species that you may encounter where your grid cell is. So first we're going to start with some of the more common species that are very easily confused with one another. The first one being Bombus pennsylvanicus, and you'll see that that occurs twice, once in the black-tailed group, once in the striped group. And that's because bumblebees exhibit color pattern variation within species. So this bee is listed in two places because it fits both of those categories depending on which color variation you ended up collecting. And it's very similar looking to Bombus fraternus as well as auricomis. So when we just look at Bombus pennsylvanicus, or the American bumblebee, the hairs on the front of the face and the top of the head are black. There's yellow in front of the wings on the thorax and a black stripe between the wings. And then behind the wings, it can be black or yellow, as you can see in the two illustrations on the screen here and the ones that are listed on your identification sheet. And if you look in the photo, it's kind of a mix of both of those extremes. Behind the wings, you can see that there are actually some very faint yellow hairs on the thorax. And then when we look at the abdomen, as we should have learned in the previous presentation, is that the abdomen is made up of 6 different sections on a female bee, and each of those sections is called a tergite. So here T1 stands for tergite 1. It is the closest section to the thorax. All the way down to T6. For pennsylvanicus, T1 is usually in our area half black and half yellow, although it can be completely yellow. T2 and T3 are also yellow, and then T4 through T6 are black. And a species that's easily confused with pennsylvanicus is Bombus auricomis, or the black and gold bumblebee. The key characteristic here between the two, though, is that this bee has yellow hairs on top of its head. So if you look really closely at the photo, you can see that there's a very small patch of yellow hairs on top of this bee's head. But other than that, the color pattern is very similar on the thorax as well as the abdomen compared to pennsylvanicus. The last one that you might confuse pennsylvanicus or auricomis with is Bombus fraternus, or the southern plains bumblebee. And this is a species of greatest conservation need in Nebraska, so data points of this one are going to be important for us to pay attention to. The hairs on the front of the face and the top of the head are black. There's yellow in front of the wings and behind the wings, with a black stripe in between the wings. And then T1 and T2 are yellow. And an interesting field characteristic about this one is that the hairs on the abdomen sort of lay flat against the abdomen, and they kind of look like they've been greased back. So when we look at all 3 of these bees side by side and where they occur in the United States, The black line encompasses data points that have been collected before 2002, whereas the white line encompasses data that was collected between 2002 and 2012. And you can see that Pennsylvanicus is pretty widespread throughout the United States, with the exception of the Pacific Northwest. Black and gold bumblebee occurs pretty commonly throughout Nebraska, and southern plains is a less frequently observed bumblebee. So looking at the states, all the white and gray dots that you see are historical records, and the black dots are more recent records that were collected in the early 2000s. But all three of these bees we can see occur throughout all of Nebraska. So when trying to differentiate which bee you have, the key characteristics to look for with Pennsylvanicus are that there are black hairs on top of the head and the front of the face, and T1 through T3 has yellow. With Bombus auricomis, that one is going to have yellow on top of the head and yellow on T2 and T3. And Bombus fraternus is going to have a black head, but yellow on T1 and T2. So very similar amounts of yellow on all of these bees, but where they are is a little bit different. So see if it has that yellow patch on the head. See which sections of the abdomen the yellow stripes occur, and that's going to help you figure out which bee you have. So the next group we're going to move into is the black-tailed bumblebees, and these are some of the most common bees that we're going to collect. So Bombus impatiens, or the common eastern bumblebee, was actually the most commonly collected bee by the community scientists that participated in 2019. The hairs on the front of the face of this bee are black, and the top of their head is yellow. When we look at the thorax, it's yellow, but in the center there's black hairs mixed in that sort of make the shape of an upside-down teardrop. And on the abdomen, there's only a single yellow stripe on the first tergite. And this is a very common bee, and it's also the commercially reared bumblebee that's shipped across the United States. The next is Bombus bimaculatus, or the two-spotted bumblebee. And this one has a very telltale sign of that yellow W shape on T2. So if you see this W shape on T2, pretty clear that you have Bombus bimaculatus. And next when we look at Bombus graciacalis, or the brown-belted bumblebee, this one has a black head, and the thorax is yellow with a black circle in the center. And the abdomen has a yellow T1, and then T2 has a crescent shape on it. And the color of this crescent can be yellow or brown. And then T3 through 6 are black. And this is a very common species spread throughout the United States. And a good field characteristic for this one is that it almost has a buzz cut look to it. So once you start recognizing what bumblebees look like up close, you'll see that some of them have long hair, some of them have short hair. And in the case of the brown-belted bumblebee, it has very short and very even hair that looks like it just got a buzz cut. And then we have Bombus vagans, or the half-black bumblebee. This one has black hairs on the front of its face and yellow on the top. And it has a yellow thorax with a black circle in the center. And then T1 and T2 are yellow. And opposite of Bombus graciacalis, Bombus vagans is one of the bumblebees that has long, uneven hair, so it looks a little bit shaggy in appearance. And looking at the national range of some of these species, we see that the common eastern bumblebee is, in fact, pretty common in the eastern United States. And the brown-belted bumblebee is spread pretty widely throughout the entire United States. And in Nebraska, we again have white and gray triangles representing historical records and black records from the early 2000s. And for Bombus impatiens, if we were to create this map today, it would look a little bit different because Bombus impatiens are commercially reared and have been shipped throughout the United States. And I would guess that they are probably in almost every county in Nebraska. For the brown-belted bumblebee, you can see that it's been collected both historically and more recently from the east all the way out west. With the two-spotted bumblebee, again, more common in the eastern United States, and the half-black bumblebee looks to be more of a northeastern species. When we look at them in just Nebraska, you can see again that both species have been collected in the east and the west. And with a lot of these maps, you'll see that some counties, like out in the southern panhandle or the central part of the state, there's not a lot of records. And that's not necessarily saying that the bumblebee doesn't exist there. It might just be for the simple fact that nobody has sampled there. So with all four species, when we try and compare them, the key things that you want to look for is the yellow W on T2, representing Bombus bimaculatus. Bombus vagans will have yellow on T1 and T2. The common eastern bumblebee will only have yellow on its first tergite. And Bombus griseacalis will have a brown or yellow crescent shape on T2. So now we're just going to finish out the black-tailed group and take a look at Bombus nevadensis, Bombus morrisoni, and Bombus fervidus. Bombus nevadensis is a bee that has black hairs on the front of its face and the top of its head. The thorax is predominantly yellow, but it has a black circle in the center. And T1 through 3 are yellow, with T4 through T6 being black. And relative to other bumblebees, this is a pretty robust species and tends to have a chunky rectangular shape to it. And looking at Bombus morrisoni, or the Morrison bumblebee, the front of the face has black hairs, but it can have yellow mixed in, and the top of the head has yellow hairs as well. The thorax on this species is all yellow, and on the abdomen, T1 through 3 and sometimes 4 are yellow. And you can see that the fourth segment in this photo here is actually yellow. This is more of an uncommon species, and there haven't been any recent records collected in Nebraska, but if you do collect one of these, you'll likely be sampling in the western part of the state. And the last black-tailed species we're going to look at is Bombus fervidus, or the yellow bumblebee. This bee has a black head and yellow in front of the wings and behind the wings, and then it has a narrow black band between the wings. T1 through 4 are yellow, and T5 and 6 are black. So looking side by side at their ranges, we see that Nevada and the Morrison bumblebee both tend to reside in the western United States, whereas the yellow bumblebee is pretty widely dispersed, except for the southern United States. And in Nebraska, we see that nevadensis as well as morrisoni have largely only been observed in the western part of the state, but fervidus has been recorded pretty widely. So when you get a predominantly yellow bee with a black tail, the way to separate these out, for nevadensis, if it has that chunky, robust shape to it with a black head and yellow on T1 through T3, you probably got nevadensis. Morrisoni has an all-yellow thorax, which is unique. And then looking at Bombus fervidus, there's yellow on T1 through T4 with a black band between the wings. So when you look at these species, each one of these has a very different thorax. So if you get an all-yellow bee, or a mostly yellow bee with a black tail, you should first look at the thorax to see if there's a circle, if there's a black band, or if it's just all yellow. Next, we're going to move into the red-tailed group. So the first species is Bombus bifarius, and this is the two-form bumblebee, which you can see by the illustrations and the photos here that it does indeed have two forms. So the front of the face and the top of the head are going to have yellow or white hairs. The thorax is going to have yellow in front of the wings, black between the wings, and then yellow behind the wings. But behind the wings, it's also going to have a black V, which you can see in both of these photos and the illustrations, where there's two yellow patches separated by a black V in there. And then the abdomen is where the two forms kind of takes its place. So T1 and T4 are going to be yellow, but T2 and T3 can vary whether they're black or orange. And if you collect this species, you'll likely be out in the western part of the state. Bombus huntii is the next one, or hunt bumblebee. The front of the face and the top of the head are yellow. There's yellow in front of the wings and behind the wings. And then there's a black band between the wings. And the color pattern on this bee's abdomen is very characteristic. If you see the yellow, orange, orange, yellow pattern, it's pretty clear that you have huntii. And again, this is more of a western species, but it has been observed a few times in central Nebraska as well. Next, we have Bombus rufocinctus, or the red-belted bumblebee. This bumblebee here is one of the ones that has the most color patterns within a single species. But for the most part, the top of the head will be yellow. There will be yellow in front of the wings and behind the wings. In between the wings can be a black band or a black circle. T1 is usually yellow, but T2 through T5 can be orange, they can be yellow, they can be black. So again, it's a very highly variable species. That's a reason why it's important to get good photographs of the face so that we can see the cheek length and the abdomen. Next, we have Bombus centralis, or the central bumblebee. The front of its head is yellow and the top of its head is yellow. The thorax has yellow in front of the wings and behind the wings, with a black band in between the wings. And the abdomen has a very nice symmetrical pattern to it. The first two tergites are yellow, the second two are orange, and the last two are black. Relative to other bumblebees, this is a smaller species, and again, if you collect this, you'll likely be out sampling in the western part of the state. So when we look at the national range of Bombus bifarius and Bombus huntii, we can see they're very much western species, but they've been recorded in the panhandle of Nebraska. Then we have the red-belted bumblebee and the central bumblebee. The central, again, is a western species that likely occurs out in the panhandle, and the red-belted bumblebee is more of a northern/western species. Looking at the states for these two, they've both only been collected up in the northwestern part of Nebraska. But again, that could be a result of our sampling effort, and that not a lot of people have been out searching for some of these bees. So that could change after the atlas. When we look at all four of them side by side and try and pick out a characteristic for each bee, Bombus bifarius will have that black V on its thorax in between a yellow band. Bombus huntii has the characteristic pattern of yellow, orange, orange, yellow. Bombus centralis has T1 and T2 yellow and is relatively small. And if it doesn't match any of those three, you might have Bombus rufocinctus, which again is the species that is highly variable. Next, we're going to look at bees that have white on the body, and there's only two species that may occur here. One of them being occidentalis. It has a couple different color patterns to it. So Bombus occidentalis, or the western bumblebee, is a species of conservation concern and is pretty uncommon in our area, but it could still exist here. The front of the face and the top of the head are black with yellow mixed in. The thorax has yellow in front of the wings, and the remainder of the thorax is black, but it can have yellow mixed in the back, like this photo that you see here. For the abdomen, T1 is usually black. T5 has white or gray hairs on it, and there can be some yellow mixed in between T2 and T4. And the last bee that has some white on it is Bombus appositus, or the white-shouldered bumblebee. And this one, right away when you look at it, you can see that there's two different shades of yellow on this bee. So the front of the face, the top of the head, and the thorax all have this pale yellow color, whereas the abdomen is made up of golden yellow or straw yellow. Relative to other bumblebees, this is a larger species, and again, this one will likely be found out west. When we look at the ranges of these, you can see that both of them are more commonly associated with the western United States. And in Nebraska, when we look at the ranges, you can see that both of them have only been collected in the very northwestern part of the state. For Bombus occidentalis, that might be true still, but we don't know. But being a species of greatest conservation need and showing such strong population decline, it's not likely that it occurs in too many other counties in Nebraska. However, for Bombus appositus, this might not be the case. It might, again, just be due to our sampling effort. And once more of us are out there actively looking for bumblebees, we might find some more occurrences of them. So key characteristics for this bee are looking for white or gray on T5 for occidentalis, or looking for those two tones of yellow for Bombus appositus, the pale yellow on the head and the thorax, and the golden yellow on the abdomen. Next, we're going to go into the cuckoo bumblebees, and we learned about their life history and parasitism in the previous presentation. Here, we're just going to focus on the identification of the different cuckoo bees. So there's 4 different species that could occur in our area. One of them is Bombus citrinus, which has a couple different color pattern variations. Bombus suckley, Bombus insularis, and Bombus variabilis. And underneath each species, it shows which bees they have been found present in the nest and which bees they have actually been found breeding in the nest. So when we look under Bombus suckley, which is a species of conservation concern, you can see that it's been found in 4 different colonies, but it's been found breeding in Bombus occidentalis. And given that Bombus occidentalis is a species of conservation concern, it would only make sense that its parasite, Bombus suckley here, is also a species of conservation concern. So first looking at Bombus citrinus, or the lemon cuckoo bee, the front of the face of this bee is black, but it can have some yellow mixed in. The top of the head is yellow. The thorax is entirely yellow, even on the sides. And then T1 has some yellow on the side, which you can see in the big photo here. There's a small patch of yellow on that first tergite. And then T3 also has some degree of yellow on it. If you collect this bee, it'll likely be out in the eastern part of the state. Next, we have Bombus suckley, or Suckley Cuckoo Bumblebee. This bee has a black head and a yellow thorax with a black band in between the wings, and that black band sort of has a little droplet going down into the yellow band behind the wings, which you can see in the illustration as well as the photo in the bottom left. T3 and T5 on the abdomen of this bee can have some yellow at the edges, like you see in the large photo. Most of them will have yellow on T4 with a black patch in the center. This is a species that's listed as critically endangered by the International Union on Conservation of Nature. And then we have Bombus insularis, or the indiscriminate bumblebee. The front of this bee's face is black, but it has a very dense yellow patch near the antennae. So in both of these photos, when you look at the top of the head and the front of the face, you can see bright yellow patches. And that's pretty key for this bee. The thorax has yellow in front of the wings, and it can be black or yellow behind the wings. And then T3 through 5 has yellow on the sides of the abdomen. When looking at Bombus variabilis, or the variable cuckoo bumblebee, this is a very uncommon bee that is listed again as critically endangered under the International Union on Conservation of Nature. And there aren't very many photos of this bee in the wild, so I put up the color pattern variation that came out of the Bumblebees of Eastern United States, which is a PDF you can find online for free. And even in there, they have a quote that says, "Because of the extreme scarcity of this species, natural history and ecology details are not well known. Photos of the species in the wild are also scarce." So if you do find a bee that matches this color pattern of yellow on the thorax, but a predominantly black abdomen, it's going to be a very nice record. When we look at the range maps for Nebraska, you can see that citrinus is more commonly collected on the eastern part of the state, and that Suckley has been found in the east as well as the west. And for the indiscriminate cuckoo bee, it was recorded in east and central Nebraska and western Nebraska. Variabilis was more commonly recorded out in the Panhandle, but it has been observed in Lancaster County. So when looking at these four species side by side, if you find one that has an all yellow thorax and black hairs on the front of the face with yellow on T3, you've probably got citrinus. For Suckley, if you find a bee that has a black band between the wings with a black patch in the center of T4. And for insularis, that dense yellow patch on the front of the face near the antennae. And if you do happen to find variabilis, we've decided that you just win the atlas overall. The last group that we're going to look at are similar species that are found in surrounding states. Not necessarily have they been observed in Nebraska, but if you go out sampling near the borders of Nebraska, there is a possibility that you'll collect a bee that's not commonly found here. And those are the tricolored bumblebee, or Bombus ternarius, which you'll likely find if you're sampling near the northern border of Nebraska. The fuzzy horned bumblebee, or Bombus mixtus, if you're out in the Panhandle. Or the yellowhead bumblebee, or Bombus flavifrons, again, if you're out in the Panhandle. That one is associated with higher altitudes, so it's less likely that we'll find it, but the range is still near the state, so we put it on here. And the last bee that we need to talk about is Bombus affinis, which again is unlikely that we will collect in Nebraska, but given that they collected the species in Iowa, which is a neighboring state, we had to throw it in here. So Bombus affinis is the rusty patch bumblebee, one that many of you have probably heard of. It's the first federally listed bumblebee under the Endangered Species Act. So if anybody does happen to amazingly catch one of these, there are some extra steps that we have to take. Key characteristics for this bee are that T1 is yellow and T2 has this brownish, orangish, reddish, rusty, if you will, a rusty patch on T2 that's circled by yellow. And the reason for its decline is likely due to an introduced pathogen from commercially reared bumblebees. And then lastly, I just want to remind you to be aware of variation. So while we present to you the different species on a single sheet, each species has different color patterns within. So here I have Bombus griseacalis and all the colors of the queen in the top row, all the colors of the worker, and all the colors of the male in the last row. And even in this picture, you can see that there are two color patterns being displayed. So just be aware that if your bee does not match one of the bees on the identification sheet, it's probably some sort of color variation. And a good way to check color variation is by getting the book Bumblebees of North America, or by going online to type in bumblebees of Western United States. And that's all. That's a nice overview of the approximately 20 species we have in the state.